Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 162nd edition of the Frank and Stan chat. And for those of you watching on video, you'll see that there is a colleague at the bottom of our screen, and this is Aelwyn Pugh. Hello, Aelwyn.
Hello.
Hello. I've known Aelwyn, I think the first time I met Aelwyn was in 1999 when I think he visited the primary school I was head teacher of as we were going for the school's curriculum award. Um, and that led to a nice visit down to the Barbican in London to receive the award. But it was quite a significant thing for our school because it sort of made us really reflect on the place of the curriculum, the place, the town where we were, and how we were bringing all of that into the curriculum. So I've known Aelwyn since then. It's great to have you. I can't wait to hear the sort of things you're going to cover. But hello, Stan. You've not been well this week, have you?
I've been under the weather, driven by I would call it grandchild transmitted virus.
Uh, the GTV.
Yeah. Not sure where he got it from, but he has just started nursery, so that might well be the case. He recovered within 24 hours. It's taken me 3 days. It's taken Jill 3 days, and his dad 3 days.
Do you want to put on record, though, here, Stan, that actually you are a good nurse and that Jill actually had breakfast? And did it have a vase with a flower on the tray?
I don't want to go down that road, Frank. I don't think I'm quite that good.
Aelwyn, do you want to just introduce yourself? Because I'm sure there are one or two people who are not quite sure who you are. They might have seen you or met you over in your career, but just give us a little summary of what you've done in your life.
Right, I'm Aelwyn, although other people will call me Aelwyn, Elwyn, Olwyn, or any other version, and that's just to my face. I started teaching in Magdalen College School in Oxford, and then after 5 years of teaching music and English there, I went and did some research in the psychology of music. Then I taught in primary and secondary schools, including at that time the largest comprehensive in the country, 12 form entry with over 2,000 pupils. I then went on into teacher education at Sunderland, what is now University of Sunderland, where I was a senior lecturer, coordinator for the creative arts, CPD, anything else they could ask me to do for no extra money. Then I moved to work for Liverpool LEA, and again, I did vast numbers of various jobs while I was there, but I first went there as a music advisor and school improvement officer, and had to reapply for my job about 7 times, not because I was particularly bad, but because the authority was going through all kinds of turmoil at the time. During that time, Ofsted was established, and I was in the first tranche of Reggie's, doing my first inspection in 1993, and I then in 2001 became HMI and was there till 2010. So I have worked all that time.
Was it 2010 or 2020?
2020, beg your pardon.
Yes, yeah.
2020. And maths is not my strong point. And to keep myself sane, I used to write articles and publish 5 books and poetry in Welsh and articles in Welsh and English and so on. I retired after 49 and a half years of work, and people said, what are you going to do next? And I thought, well, having done that much, I don't think I need to do anymore. I had been learning German. I do a little bit of writing, and I play the piano and the violin and so on, but no longer in anger. I just play for my own entertainment, and I play very occasionally play the organ for weddings and funerals. Same pieces, fast for weddings, slow for funerals. That's me.
Do you know, it's funny because today that I mentioned before that I have a comment in the I think it's the Times Educational Supplement about the proportion of HMI who were head teachers, and it's currently I think 60%. But actually, you've sort of run right through that sort of attack on that sort of position, because what you clearly weren't a head teacher, but
No.
what you brought and what you brought to inspection and what you brought to HMI, there's that vast wealth of understanding about the education system more broadly.
Mm,
And for those who are coming through as head teachers who perhaps got been in a school, perhaps a couple of schools, they then come in, want to be an inspector. That's quite a narrow range of experiences, isn't it?
mm.
When
Yeah,
you're actually inspecting in an area that you're not familiar with, in a setting that's perhaps might be socially challenging, more challenging than you've ever seen, to actually sort of be expected to make some judgments about effectiveness against that. I'm confident, Aelwyn, that I'm not saying you'd get the judgments right, but I think there's a fair chance you'll be more right, perhaps,
mm,
than the other person with the very narrow range of experience.
mm. Yeah, I think that obviously there is a need for leaders, but I think that when I first joined HMI, certainly there were people from a very, very wide range of backgrounds, and it was very exciting to be in a meeting with these, especially if you were doing a large inspection of a local authority or whatever, to be able to hear all these various perspectives. I think there is a danger that if you just have it from one aspect, you don't have you have people who will have been used to doing what's required of them and haven't really thought through. And I think what Ofsted certainly, well, what HMI certainly used to consist of was a lot of thinkers.
Mm.
I'm not quite sure that it's there to the same extent nowadays.
Yeah.
Or certainly, I mean, don't get me wrong, you weren't rewarded for thinking. Nobody encouraged it, but you could do it without being sacked.
Stan, what's caught your eye this week?
Well, having been in bed for most of the week, not a lot, but I did manage to pick up a new way of organising government, I think, on, was it yesterday, the day before, when the Prime Minister announced a whole lot of things that he was going to stop that had never actually started. Like meat tax and the number of people you had to have in your car, and 7 bins, or was it 8 bins? Things that never were going to happen, but suddenly by stopping them, that's been a good thing and made us all slightly better off. And I just wondered if the working group who are looking to reduce teacher workload operate on that same process. There's lots of things that they could stop happening that never really happened to create some space in the curriculum. And I was just musing through a list of things that people had proposed never to become serious, but in the same vein, neither was meat tax, to be honest. So we could perhaps start to say, if we stop bubble wrap studies, which is where children are encouraged to develop their fine motor skills by popping bubble wrap, there's some time in reception. We could take out ancient Greek in the early years.
Yeah.
That would gather some time. Chewing gum language, believing that chewing gum can enhance your language development, so you chew as you learn to speak. Balloon animal history, I'm not going into the details of that. Invisible art class, where you use purely your imagination to develop a piece of art that no one else can see. That sounds like the kind of artwork I did. But if we take these things, cloud whispering as another one, superhero ethics, banana peel botany. There's quite a few here that are bizarre things that people propose should be happening in schools that clearly never would. But if you take those out, having never introduced them, you can create probably, I would say, 20 to 30% of teachers' time. Job done. Where are we, where we invent things that didn't happen or were never going to happen, say I've stopped them happening, and therefore saved you some time or money?
Yeah.
It's absolutely bizarre.
Yeah. I agree. I think what's interesting, at last we've seen on the. I felt as though I didn't feel any pity for the Prime Minister yesterday being interviewed by Radio 4 in 10 Downing Street, but actually they didn't really go for him, over all of this. That level of challenge. But it's funny, just bringing it back to education and the point you were making before, Aelwyn, about thinking, that actually when we worked as HMI in the early days, there was an encouragement to be really quite robust in terms of the challenge to the chief inspector, and that being viewed not negatively but as a means of ensuring that whatever policy or approach was being adopted, actually you'd had your Radio 4 interview, prior to the launch, because what you don't want is everybody to keep quiet and then everybody know that something's got a massive problem with it, and then as soon as you launch it, it's out in the open because it's obvious. So I think it's really just that encouragement to get people to think that they can just say what's on their mind, not to knock you down, but to actually improve the process.
The other thing we could do, Frank, is bring things back. That do you remember ITA? Is that in your? You must be old enough.
Yeah, I am old enough.
ITA. We could bring ITA back for a short period and then get rid of it.
Yeah.
And create a space that previously wasn't there. It's the old assembly story, isn't it? Where the family are overcrowded and they bring an animal each day into the house, and then eventually they let the animals out of the house and they realise how much space they've got in the house.
Aelwyn, what's caught your eye this week?
Well, a quotation from an American zoologist of the 19th century. And he said, education today must see clearly the dual objectives, education for living and education for making a living. And I was reflecting on the shift of emphasis that happened during my lifetime as far as these two aims are concerned. Thinking back to the period before the national curriculum came, and that was really a culmination of thinking that had been happening for a previous 15 years, particularly in this country, in the USA. And the focus was on what makes an educated person, what you need to study to do that, and knowledge was analyzed into discrete bodies of skills and concepts, which were then to be the basis of a common curriculum. Now, very, very soon, the common curriculum in this country became compulsory curriculum. And I was at a meeting in London when it was announced, and there was tremendous disgust on the part of HMI at that particular time, when it was just more or less announced out of the blue. Now, the national curriculum, I think, began to go wrong very early on, basically because there was interference from government ministers and civil servants. And then there was a decision later on that some schools, like academies, didn't have to adhere to it. Ofsted took his eye off the ball. Inspectors were recruited for leadership experience rather than their knowledge of subjects. Schools eventually became judged on the basis of two subjects. There was a valiant attempt in 2019 to address or to redress the balance, but it was doomed to failure because by that stage, Ofsted had lost its expertise, and expertise had been lost in schools. Meanwhile, I think there's been an increasing emphasis on the Victorian notion of education as a means of ensuring wealth. This is why we're still obsessed with the quality of writing in schools. People were taught to write in copperplate so that their masters could be sure they weren't being diddled. And we still have that notion in the nonsense that we focus so much on that in the writing in schools rather than on its content. So there was that increasing emphasis, and I think probably the decline started with Ronald Reagan when he said, "Why should we subsidize intellectual curiosity?" I think it continues with the present Prime Minister with his focus on differentiating between subjects on their basis of their potential contribution to the economy, and suddenly students are being frowned on if they wish to study English literature and the arts and so on. Now, And in schools, I think decisions are being made on what is regarded as being economically advantageous to people. And what worries me is that sometimes those are made without, with the thin veneer of thinking this is going to be good for children who come from poor backgrounds, and they need to be able to get out of that. Yes, it's true, but it doesn't take into consideration what happens in our minds. It's one thing to earn money. What is happening in your mind during that time? And I was thinking of a time when I went into a school, and in a very poor area, a large secondary school, and in assembly, somebody put on a recording of Allegri's Miserere. The kids were absolutely enthralled. You know, people used to talk at that time about awe and wonder. That's the only time I saw it, but actually it was very, very real. You know, you could have heard a pin drop. These children were absolutely gobsmacked by it. And suddenly the deputy head marched to the front, didn't even phase the music out, just turned it off and said to them, "But you won't be interested in that." So when I spoke to her afterwards, I said, "Why did you do that?" Well, she said, "Because they won't be interested." I said, "That isn't what I felt." She said, "Well, look where they come from." So she pointed to the window and you could see council housing. So I said to her, "Well, do those council houses have internal loos?" "Yes, of course." "Do they have bathrooms?" "Yes, of course." "Well, it's more than I ever had as a child. And I'm glad that I wasn't subjected to this kind of preconception." Another anecdote, I won't hold you too much, but my mother worked as a cleaner in a factory. She used to love going to concerts, theatres, art galleries, and so on. And she always used to say, "This is wonderful because next week when I'm pushing a mop around, I can remember all these wonderful things." So it's important. And I also had an English teacher who made us learn reams and reams of poetry because he was quite convinced we were going to end up in prison. Two of us did. I haven't checked with them to see whether this was of any relevance, but he, as a POW in the First World War, had kept himself going by remembering all this poetry. So I think it's important that we remember the inner mind as well as the economic imperative. And when I was a student way back in the 60s, the expectation was that in our lifetime somehow we would be released from having to do daily grind, and we would be able to sit back and continue from the summer of love. Well, it never happened, or it didn't happen to me. But now we might be nearer that state of affairs. You know, people worry about AI. I don't, because I wouldn't have understood it anyway. But we'll find ways of living with it. People have adapted to such a great deal, and that therefore probably will mean that we'll get to the point where more and more people will have more and more time for themselves. And another quote I found this week by a chap called Sidney J. Harris was that the primary purpose of a liberal education is to make one's mind a pleasant place in which to spend one's leisure. And I think we ought to keep that in mind and not lose sight of it just because we're bound to UK PLC.
It's interesting. Go on, Stan, you were going to say.
I was just going to say, my first school, which was in a council estate in Salford, the head teacher said to me that all these children need is to be able to fill in a betting slip and read the back page of The Sun. That was her ambition for the children.
It's only I was part of the generation in terms of social mobility. I think I think it was a period of I don't know how it happened, but I was able to get up the social ladder. And there was a report out a couple of weeks ago saying, why has social mobility stalled? And they were drawing attention to the fact that it's not about your earnings. Your earnings in themselves, most people's earnings are not keeping up with inflation. So in a way, everyone's getting poorer if all of your wealth is based on earnings. But if you're the landed gentry, if you have property in certain parts of the country, you will be wealthy for you will be well off for your entire lifetime. And because of inheritance and little attention on inheritance tax, your children are likely to benefit. So this idea of social mobility, this idea that education in itself can climb you out of that, get you out of it can bring some economic benefit, but actually the strength of education, if it is so difficult because of taxation, whatever, the thing that needs to be stressed is its personal impact on you as an individual. The economic element of it, yes, okay, but actually it doesn't. I feel as though in my generation, I think hard work, having the right attitude, there were opportunities that became available to us which weren't available to my parents, but I'm not sure I'm seeing that level of social mobility out there now to the same degree. And I think that report, when you were talking about it, Aelwyn, I was reminded of that report, and some things are outside of our control here, like government's taxation policy. But anyway, go on, Stan.
No, I was just thinking about the curriculum and how government policy is, if we're trying to use it to generate economy, music is one of the things that generates a lot of income for and the creative arts. And yet, in my view, one person decided that music wasn't worth anything, didn't include it in a baccalaureate, didn't think it was sufficiently academic subject to be a major subject in schools, and ineffectively, almost within a term, destroyed music. And I noticed the HMI report that's just come out now has virtually said we haven't changed since that point.
And the point Aelwyn made about basically we're teaching two subjects. Yeah, that's certainly the case in primary schools, and having grandchildren now, you see, and being close to those grandchildren, the narrowness of it, the lack. In effect, their only bit of drama and music came after the SATs had been completed, when there was a joyous celebration, when you suddenly saw kids who could hold an audience. And you're thinking, well, where did you get that ability? Well, it was from a club that she joined 3 or 4 years ago. Her parents had provided that. It wasn't the school. And actually you think, well, what about all those other children whose parents didn't provide that or can't provide that? I mean, how do you feel, Aelwyn, then when you've inspected? I remember an HMI saying to me, a curriculum can't be a good curriculum if it doesn't teach geography. And there must be many schools, primary schools, where you see pretty thin levels of understanding around geography. But how do you manage to get that? How do you evaluate the effectiveness of that curriculum, that experience for young people, when it is so narrow on just maths and English?
Well, I think it takes us to what our colleague has been talking about in terms of deep dives. The problem with those is that, first of all, people have only been trained in some areas. So it doesn't surprise me that so many people are looking at history, because that's where it started from, as it were, in terms of the history of the training. My colleagues, they did try to introduce music, and they used to put it on the agenda for training. But while I was still in Ofsted, they never once got round to that, and colleagues used to sidle up to me and say, well, we won't get to that today because you're here, because they knew I would challenge and cause a problem. I don't think we actually have got to a situation, or certainly by the time I'd finished 3 years ago, we'd got to a situation where we could really assess what was happening in terms of the curriculum. And I don't know, but I don't hold out much hope that people will really focus on a broad curriculum in the future either.
Yeah.
Well, for me, and I know there's loads of arguments against this, but if what you judge children on at the age of 16 is what they can remember in a certain number of subjects, the whole of the curriculum is going to be about trying to get them to that point, rather than judging what they're capable of doing at that stage, and what the range of knowledge and understanding. See, that's not used very often now, I notice. We're on knowledge, but we're not on understanding and concepts, which again, I don't see that in anything I read at the moment. That conceptual thinking.
Well, somebody will have made a decision somewhere that some words are verboten, and that I found that very, very frustrating. I thought it was ironic that we were trying to develop the vocabulary of children, and yet we were being forced to write in demisyllables. And I thought, if Ofsted had had its way, probably Neville Chamberlain would never have been allowed to use the word consequently when he announced that we were at war with Germany. It really did worry me that really we were getting to the situation where, for some mad reason, people were assuming that parents couldn't manage this. And I worked in Liverpool for many years. And the wealth and richness of language that people from all parts of Liverpool use is famous for it. And it's not the only place. So I thought it was exceedingly insulting to turn around and say, well, parents won't understand that.
Yes.
But we have got to that situation where words it's almost an Orwellian situation.
But in Liverpool, Frank and I inspected the school in Liverpool at the time when Ofsted had decided the word satisfactory wasn't good enough, so we would use the word sound.
Yes.
And we gave a feedback to a head teacher where virtually everything had come out as sound, which in other schools when everything was satisfactory, it wasn't a very good feedback and wasn't a very good report. And I said, so how do you feel about that? He said, the parents will love it. Sound around here means sound.
Yeah, quite.
I mean, what's caught my eye this week, and it actually, and it's not all planned this, but there were the two reports that came out for three PE, geography, and music from Ofsted this week, subject reviews. And I think what I feel, I'd be interested in what Aelwyn thinks about this. I don't think Ofsted should be a place where colleagues go in and treat it as if it's like a university department. I think that Ofsted's at its best when it reports on the findings of its inspectors. And obviously, how you train up your inspectors and what you want them to focus in on, that probably is a role for somebody, as there used to be, an eminent sort of colleague who would do that work, but wouldn't present it in such a way that it was ideologically driven. It was really just presenting some of the evidence that had been found, had been produced over the last few years from academics. But actually, it was still left to inspectors to go and find out what the impact of all of this school work had been on the children. And that's where Ofsted's I think, at its best. What's so disappointing about these subject reviews that have come out, is the emphasis that's been placed on academic research. So it's a list of academics papers, of which in themselves are heavily selected. There's a vast array of other reports that could have been drawn in, but also the schools are not listed. So there's a bland statement at the end saying these schools have been chosen carefully so that they cover all the regions, schools from sort of challenging areas to less challenging areas, schools that were judged to be outstanding, whatever. But why not list them? And these reviews are actually based on visits that have been made. So in effect, that is, if you're going to make a visit and you're going to dig around for geography, for example, in a primary school, you're going to see a lot more geography. You're going to find more geography, I hope, than you would if you did a 2-day Section 5 inspection. But so in a way, they're not. I don't think they're really reflective of where reality is at the moment, because actually a lot of these schools are driven by going back again to these two subjects. So why we have the commitment and we have these SATs at the end of Key Stage 2 that are driving the curriculum so heavily for many schools, We need to break that, and then we go, I think, and do the geography deep dives or the geography visits, because then there's time for that sort of work to take place. So I feel as though the national curriculum, as you were, I think, what is it? It's not. It doesn't feel to me like the way it was meant, as it was conveyed at its launch. We are way off from what its intended purpose was. And let's face it, Aelwyn, we know colleagues, there are schools, even in those days, never taught geography, never taught music. It's not halcyon days. The national curriculum was created to give some, at least a block of time where children would get music. They would get PE, because some of them weren't getting it.
That same school, Frank, do you remember design technology? And they just said, we don't do that.
And I had a teacher at the school Aelwyn visited, and he was absolutely proud of the fact that the sink was never used, because we don't do art. We're not going to do any paint. We're never going to do that. So the caretaker, the cleaner, loved this teacher. You know what I mean? It was the tidiest classroom. There was no mess anywhere, because it was just English and maths. That's all he did.
You didn't tell me that when I came to
know. Well, actually, he'd gone by then. To be honest. Right. I would say that. But no, just going back to those times, Aelwyn, I think that curriculum award, it was the first time we'd really had to look at what we were trying to deliver here. And I remember having a session where we brought we'd been doing some work with the local community and trying to strengthen that. And I remember we had a lunch, and you I think were in this library area, and we were, and in a way we just stepped back and let the community talk to you about, this is the impact of the school on our community. And in a way, the award itself, it was great. I don't know whether everybody got the award, but the fact that those 2 years of effort were acknowledged by somebody like yourself made us feel, and we headed towards a really strong, really good Ofsted. But the curriculum award was probably more important to the development of the school than the Ofsted or some of the other stuff that came.
Well, it put the emphasis, didn't it, on celebrating the breadth of things which are happening. There were many things to celebrate in your school. I remember it very, very well, and it was a lovely experience. It amazes me, though, how Ofsted particularly has gone round in circles. I didn't always make myself popular, as you know. And I certainly didn't make myself popular when we started revisiting the curriculum, much as I supported the idea. But I remember in one training session in London, the person leading it said, and of course, what our most recent research has discovered is that the schools with the widest curriculum are the ones which have the best results in English and maths. And I blurted out, which is exactly what HMI found in 1967, which is the case, because there was a report which was published at that particular point. But and she obviously thought I was just having her on, but it worried me that we'd been through all that work had been done, and had been done by subject experts, and then it had been changed and diluted over the years and made into something which was far removed from people really thinking about it. And then, as far as music was concerned, all kinds of people waded in, so because they couldn't see the difference between music education for every child and instrumental music. So if you asked anybody, they would immediately veer off to talking about instrumental music, and that was dying, and therefore things were bad. And at the time, I used to write quite regularly for the Times Ed. Well, the Times Ed ran a campaign to save music education, and I was writing quite regularly articles on music. And I would always take the opportunity to say we're in a very good position, because for the first time since compulsory education has come in, every child in this country by law has to study music. It was always edited out. And to the point where I thought, well, it's not that is not worth writing for them anymore. But we've had this strange situation, and then, of course, as far as music is concerned, again, people began to play games with numbers. So suddenly, every child in this country is having the opportunity to play a musical instrument. It's absolute nonsense. They have the opportunity to have an instrument somewhere near them for a year at the most.
Yes.
And then the instrument, unless somebody's actually got some really well-planned ways of building on that, the child finishes. I remember saying to a head in one authority when I was inspecting new opportunities, I said he hadn't got any means of helping children whose parents couldn't afford it. And I said, well, which is better, that the child should have been shown that he can play the trombone, but it's taken away from him? Is that better than never having put him anywhere near the trombone, which he now knows he could play, but is prevented from doing so by circumstances? So we've messed around such a lot with these things, but the fact that it's been allowed to happen means that really we haven't been in earnest about a wide curriculum.
Well, that's over 40 minutes of a chat. It's amazing how it goes, isn't it? So yeah, it's been really interesting, Aelwyn. I think you brought sort of, obviously that wealth of experience has really flowed through the conversation today. It's made me think also about some of the comments I've made about head teachers leading inspections. So and again, you know, that's really helpful that you weren't aware how challenging you'd been to some views that I held. So thank you for that, and for challenging my views in a sensitive manner. So
me sensitive?
Yeah,
I think it might have been different if he'd known your views in advance and been
No, I've taken no notice.
And again, you know, thank you for giving us your time, and all being well, Frank and Stan will be back next Friday. And just one thing, we've got another spotlight conversation on next week, which we're going to do about workload, where we had a colleague came on and from an independent sector, and they look as though they're really trying to get to grips with flexible working and things like that. So we'll include that. And it's still not too late to get hold of the spotlight conversation we had with the governor from Caversham Primary School, or parent from Caversham Primary School, which has had a lot of views over the last week or so. So you can get that on the Frankenstein chat as well. Okay, we'll see you all next week. So
thanks very much, Aelwyn.
yeah, thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much.